why do we seem to fear sex more than violence? One of my great passions is comic books, and one of my favorite artists is Beto Hernandez, famous for he and his brother Jamie's series Love and Rockets. And I think it was in the graphic novel Fear of Comics, but don't quote me on that because I sold my copy and I can't verify anymore, that a couple of his characters were talking, and one says to the other something like, "Why is it that it is somehow acceptable to show a graphic scene of a man murdering a woman, but it only becomes banned and tabooed when it is a scene of a man graphically making love to that woman?" And that thought always gave me pause. He's putting his finger on such an interesting conundrum, and I think that we don't often really think about it. So I started thinking about it. And to this day, I do not really have a perfect answer, but I want to run you through my thoughts on the matter and ask you what you think about it. So going back to my childhood, the media that I grew up consuming, was there fully graphic violence? Well, certainly there was. Of course, there were concessions made to tone it down, like in Ninja Turtles. They would use swords on enemies, only if it was like a robot or something like that. Or in Conan the Adventurer, they would never really stab a snake man, just touch him and send him into the abyss. But those concessions aside, you can certainly find examples of full-on violence in media meant for kids. Sure, there were Tom and Jerry cartoons, which you could say is just silly, cartoony violence. But especially if you went to comic books, which were undoubtedly targeted toward a younger demographic, you can find very visceral depictions of real-world type violence. So then you ask yourself, well, how far does the sexuality go? And the difference is, there is a clear limit. Sure, superheroes have sexy outfits, but explicit body parts, and especially sexual acts, would not be allowed to be marketed and sold alongside quote-unquote normal material. But think about that. Of all genres of entertainment, we can categorize movies where there is more violence into sections like horror or gore or action, and no matter how many machine gun bullets fly, no matter how many dead bodies drop to the ground, no matter how many zombies get blown away by a point-blank round, the major separation in media, the line that is drawn in your local DVD seller, is between sexually explicit and then everything else. Sex is the line that we can't cross, not violence. So, number one, I suppose the thinking is, well, we need to keep that away from kids. And that's fair enough, I've got no arguments with that. But what I'm saying is, I think it goes deeper than that. It really seems to me that people, by and large, really get uncomfortable when it comes to talking about sexuality and talking about it openly. I think that there are a variety of reasons for it, but I also think that just somewhere, deep down, it seems like we have a kind of fear of where sex can go, especially when it goes too far. Whereas I think we can calmly discuss topics like murder or even genocide in a detached, clinical way. And I've always wondered why that is, or if it points to something inside us that we are afraid to face. Just the thought of discussing it seems to put a kind of uneasiness in us. Imagine telling your family or friends about a fight that you got into. Probably not an issue. But what about telling them about a sexual encounter you had? Or even as simple as asking a sex-related question to a parent or such. Suddenly, it is not something you feel like even talking to them about. Now extend this to the prison yard. There are plenty of guys who make a name for themselves through the violence they have either committed or are willing to commit. But sexual deviants and rapists, especially of the young, are absolutely reviled, and typically need to be separated from the general prison population because they will be attacked by the, again, quote-unquote normal population. I think there is something in this that really bespeaks of something unconscious at work. It's not something we even think about, we just know it, or at least somehow feel it. Imagine a person who has done the most diabolical things sexually. Now imagine a person who has done the most diabolical things violently. For some reason, we seem to feel that the sexual deviant is far worse and scarier. I personally think that this is another example of a commonly held myth. I think that the reality of the abhorrent nature of a real murderer has kind of gotten lost on us because of how mundane the act is in the media we consume on a daily basis. We see shootings, stabbings, explosions, poisonings, hangings, and any number of horrible killings to the point where I genuinely think we just don't take it seriously anymore, or at least as serious as the act is. How many killings has the average person seen in their lifetime in movies, TV shows, video games, etc.? How many have you seen? Now, how many times have you seen a real human being die? Seen a real person being killed? With the internet as it is, I could be getting wildly differing answers depending on who I'm asking. So I will just tell you the story about myself. The answer is very occasionally online, and in real life, never. At the time of this recording, I'm 40, and just a few years ago that thought occurred to me. The fact that I'm basically about middle-aged, and even though I've seen a million media deaths, I've never really seen an actual human death. And it was around that time that I did see a video of one. It was a video, I think, somewhere in Brazil, or at least South America. It seemed like the most nondescript, even boring-looking security-type footage of just some people in a restaurant or something. Then all of a sudden, a guy, a grown man who looked pretty strong, had taken a butcher knife out of a bag or something. And before anyone could even register what he was doing, he plunged it viciously into the back of a young girl who had her back turned to him. And look, it was probably one of the most stomach-turning things I have ever seen in my life. These weren't some stupid actors and actresses hamming it up on a stage. The surprise and pain in her expression were so heartbreakingly real. And again, bear in mind, this was a young, teenage-looking girl. Now, I'm not mentioning this to be disgusting. I'm not saying all this to be flippant. I'm saying that for some odd reason, popularly speaking, societally speaking, I don't think we take real-life violence seriously enough. Violence has become like a video game. There are no real repercussions. Even when in reality, those repercussions are every bit as real. Now, when it comes to a sex offender, I've heard the phrase, hang him by the balls, innumerable times. But when it comes to a violent offender, I have heard any number of excuses, people thinking it's cool, women saying there's something sexy or mysterious about a bad boy or a criminal type. Essentially, it seems like in the abstract, we think that sexual deviants have no possible path to atonement. I can personally think of very few people who have been convicted of sexual crimes who didn't have to leave public life in disgrace. But I could think of many people, men and women, who were either flat out convicted of or flat out admitted to robbing, beating, or even killing people who seem to have no problems fitting back in after serving time or without serving time altogether. Believe me, I have no problem saying that a convicted sex offender is horrible. But what bothers me about the whole thing is how readily people will just glaze over stark and brutal violence. Again, it seems to me there is just no fear of violence in the abstract, but a deep fear, or maybe disgust or loathing is a better word, for what we feel for sexuality gone too far. In fact, it's a pet peeve of mine. I've asked myself this question many times, and now I ask you, the viewer. What can you say about rape or sexual violence that you can't say about simply violence? It's a humiliating violation of your body? Check. It's forceful and against the victim's will? Check. It leaves mental damage and scars that don't easily heal? Makes the victim afraid to exist in their own body? Afraid to go to the crime scene? Sometimes afraid to leave their house? Afraid of their fellow man? Check, check, check. In fact, the only real difference that I've ever come up with is that sexual violence opens the possibility of pregnancy. But really, that's about all that I can think of. I just don't get it. I sometimes feel annoyed because I think it is something of a manufactured political opinion hammered into us that we never sit back, think about, and challenge. We're always told that sexual violence is unique to women and that even joking about it is unacceptable. Meanwhile, the simple observation that prison rape is far more prevalent than rape in normal society hardly raises an eyebrow. Well, they're just horrible men victimizing other horrible men. Seems to be the prevailing attitude, said with a shrug. Several people have lost jobs or gotten into hot water for joking about rape. I have never seen someone lose a job for joking about violence. For me, all this came crashing down a few years ago during 2015 with Season 5 of Game of Thrones. I remember how the season held strong ratings throughout, except for a couple of episodes that angered fans. One of them, that first big dip you see right there, was for the rape of a popular female character. The other, smaller dip? Well, that was not a big deal. It was simply the burning to death of a little girl. I mean, really, where the hell have we gone? Do you really think it is somehow more despicable to molest a woman than to stab a woman to death? You're entitled to your own opinion on the matter, but so am I. And I think this is the opinion of a person who just doesn't understand the reality of a stabbing. Here's an example of a recent situation where a Chicago area female officer was caught by surprise when the suspect just bowled through the taser and started stabbing her with a large butcher knife. Luckily for her, she had a ballistic vest on that stopped the knife and saved her life. I can't play it in full because of YouTube censoring, but I want you to pay attention to how she sounds after the encounter. Listen to how hard and fast she is breathing, and how obviously shaken she is by the whole thing.
You okay, son? Holy shit. You okay? You okay? You alright? Damn. Get over.
60 rounds have been apart.
I'm fine. Did it get
It didn't go through. It didn't go through.
Where you at?
He stabbed me in my vest and my stomach.
This is the part that we just seem to miss when we just do an analysis in our heads and mindlessly conclude that physical violence isn't such a big deal, that it's all just a Hollywood movie. So I want to make this as clear as I can. I don't think violent crimes are any better or somehow not as immoral as sexual crimes. I just think we have lost perspective on the issue. We seem to have a kind of Hollywood blockbuster movie version of violence in our heads, but violence in the real world is not at all like a movie. Real world violence isn't some Rocky movie with two equally conditioned athletes going back and forth trading semi-equal blows until finally after 12 rounds one of them falls. That's just not how it works in real life. Violence in the real world is typically three things. It is usually instant, it's decisive, and it is almost always completely unfair. When an adult male lion sinks his teeth into a lost baby prey animal, it simply is what it is. It isn't kind, it isn't nice, but it is the reality of survival in the jungle. When a serial killer or any murderer takes a fellow human life, it's very often the same. A person overwhelming their victim with either weapons or shooting them or jumping out and surprising them in a position where they can't fight back. But we're not in the jungle. We are in a world of magical technology, the likes of which our ancestors would have died for. So the taking of life by a serial murderer has absolutely no justification. Just like the sexual violence of a rapist. Killing in a relatively comfortable society, completely different from killing in a jungle for survival, has no purpose at all and no excuse. I just can't help but wonder why it doesn't seem to shock us. And I can't help but think it points to something lacking in our real perspective of the world. But anyway, those are my thoughts. What are yours? 見てくれてありがとうございます。さようなら。